Hello, folks. This week we moved from the discussions that we've had over the last few weeks, and from Holy Week specifically last week. I hope you had a good Holy Week, a good celebration of our Lord's Passion and of the resurrection. Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. It is a good thing to reflect on from time to time exactly what all that implies. The vindication of Jesus' ministry, the vindication of his ministry and his place alongside the Father, his calling upon our lives and the promise that it bears for our own futures. It's the best time of the year in a lot of ways. Of course, Good Friday, what was it, Tony Campolo was, it's Good Friday but Sunday's coming, right? You know, it's the recognition of the terrible events of Good Friday end with the vindication of Christ and the completion of his work that restores us to right relationship to God. This week we move to our discussion of capital punishment. Now, capital punishment is an area, is a topic that is Christians fall on both sides of this issue. Is it okay to execute certain kinds of criminals? Is it not okay? And both sides feel this passionately. It's interesting that while I was working with sojourners, one of the groups that we did some work on with was a group that was out to end capital punishment. Now the story is an interesting one. Richard Viguerie, I don't know if you've ever heard that name or not, but he happens to be a conservative, and he founded basically the direct mail marketing strategies. Take me a minute to get that straight. Sorry about that. And so Richard's a very successful businessman. And as I said, he's conservative, so he would be on the flip side politically from Jim Wallace. And so Jim tells the story that he was working out at the gym one weekend, and someone comes up and talks to him and says, I think, aren't you Jim Wallace? Yes, I am. I'm Richard Viguerie. And they get into this conversation. So these two men who have very different views about a lot of things politically have come together around this issue of death penalty. And what Richard said was that as a Catholic he was opposed to the death penalty. He understood that Jim was as well. And he wondered if they could move the needle, to use a popular metaphor, if they could move the needle on the issue of capital punishment if they joined forces. And I actually got to sit in on a couple of meetings where there were folks who had joined this discussion and this attempt to put a stop to capital punishment. What's interesting is the group that had gathered together was a fairly wide variety of individuals. What you had, for example, was someone whose brother was a death row inmate. In fact, he was the Unabomber's brother, as I recall. There was someone else whose family had been the victim of a crime. Someone in their family had been murdered. And then they were present at the execution of the one who killed their family member. And they were now opposed to the death penalty, basically because they said this brings no closure. It doesn't bring the lost one back, and it just sort of dissipates in anger, you know, when it's finally, the death penalty is finally invoked. And he said, and it isn't just the death penalty itself, but it's the years and years and years that go on as, what's the word I'm looking for, as the appeals work themselves out, and as they try to get some sort of closure on those issues. But again, no closure comes, and the things just sort of drag on, and every time there's appeal, it just sort of gets, the wound gets broken open again. So there's a lot of complex information. I want to highlight some of the things in the book, but first I wanted to, I will link for you this particular page. It is the Bureau, BJS Bureau of Justice Statistics, and I think it would be worth you just sort of poking around in here a little bit and taking a look at the sorts of data that are there. BJS.gov, www.bjs.gov, but I'll save that and post it for you. Here's one of the things that it says, highlights. At the year end of 2011, so it's a little over 2 years ago now, 35 states and the Federal Bureau of Prisons held, guess how many inmates there are on death row across the country? Hundreds? Thousands? At year end, 35 states and the Federal Bureau of Prisons held 3,082 inmates under sentence of death, which was 57 fewer than in 2010. Of prisoners under sentence of death at year end, 55% were white, 42% were black, and 387, which would be about 11%, were Hispanic inmates. In 2012, 9 states executed 43 inmates, which was the same number as in 2011. So, what is if you look at the breakdown of Hispanic population, white population, African American population, the breakdown in the culture at large is very different than those on death row. In fact, I helped write this book, Living God's Politics, which was in a book that went alongside of Jim Wallace's book, God's Politics. This was a study guide would be too narrow a thing to call it, but it basically took the 7 main themes from God's Politics and then gave a week's worth of attention to each one of them, beginning with an outline of the data and then biblical reflections and so on. But here's what this book was written in like 06, I believe it was. Perhaps most disturbing, and this actually I put this in the racism chapter because I was trying to draw attention to how disproportionate some of the issues around justice as they get worked out with regard to race. Perhaps most disturbing of all the racial disparities is the number of executions and death row inmates. In 82% of the studies reviewed, a 1990 U.S. General Accounting Office report on death penalty sentencing revealed, so this was a 25-year-old study now, 82% of the studies, the race of the victim was found to influence the likelihood of being charged with capital murder or receiving the death penalty. That is, those who murdered whites were found more likely to be sentenced to death than those who murdered blacks. From 1976 to the present, which again would have been about 05, African Americans convicted of killing white people have been 17 times more likely to be executed than white people convicted of killing African Americans. In October 2005, death row across the country consisted of the following. Well, it's a very similar breakdown to what I just gave you, so I don't need to repeat that. But it's appropriate that the discussion of death penalty comes relatively close to our discussion on racism because they do seem to be so closely connected. On page 451, which is where this chapter starts, you'll see put in very blunt and stark terms right off the bat the contrast in the two positions. On the one hand, one side says capital punishment is barbaric, discriminatory, and counterproductive, it should be abolished. On the other side, capital punishment is just, pro-life, and a deterrent against violence. It's a tragic but necessary duty of government. And as they go on to note, this is a position clearly held by Christians. These positions are held by Christians, both of the positions. Sorry. You ever have days when you just can't quite say what you want to say? There are Christians on both sides of this issue, and they feel those positions strongly, and they would word them the way that you see here. So it's not a matter of Christians are here and non-Christians are here. It's much fuzzier than that. Now, when we look at Jesus' own teaching, as he notes on 452, Jesus clearly taught pardon and repentance rather than capital punishment. He goes on down here to talk about Genesis 9 and the arguments that are made for justification in some cases actually even the requirement of imposing the death penalty on certain kinds of crimes. On page 453, middle of the page, those opposed to capital punishment tend to favor the priority of the New Testament over the Old in determining God's will regarding the punishment of criminals. In other words, they take the example of Christ as the one that's primary in trying to make a judgment about how you think about capital punishment. On page 454, there is an important point made here that I want to sort of amplify and make into a distinction. First paragraph. Apart from the biblical material, however, retribution or retributive justice is given as the chief purpose of capital punishment. Now, there are two particular ways in broad categories to think about justice and punishment for crimes. There's the retributive theory, which basically says the reason that we engage in killing people is to balance the invisible scales of justice. It's to make someone pay for their crime. So that's a retributive theory. On the other side, you have the rehabilitative theory. Those on that side argue that punishment's goal is not to balance some invisible scales of justice, but rather to move the person toward restoration to the community. Now, in some cases, the crimes may be so severe that that restoration is very limited, in the sense that they may have to spend the rest of their life in prison, only being visited on occasion by friends or relatives or whatever. But those are the two different theories. They didn't pull those things out as clearly as I might have liked for them to in this particular chapter, but I think it's an important distinction to remember. What is the goal of punishing criminals? Is it to make somebody pay for their crimes, or is it really, should it be about rehabilitation? The goal is to restore someone to right relationship. In a book by Joel Green and maybe Max Turner, it's called Recovering the Scandal of the Cross, and they look at Oriental justice systems, and the difference, the primary distinction that they pull out between Western justice systems and Eastern justice is that we in the West tend to think about these invisible scales of justice, trying to balance things out, and that's why one of the images for justice is the woman with blindfold on holding out the scales, right? It's unbiased, and then justice is making sure the crime fits our punishment fits the crime. The image in some Oriental cultures, though, however, is a judge with eyes wide open. The goal here isn't to be separated and balance the scales, but to rather watch very closely at where the breakdowns in relationship occur. And they give a particular example. It wouldn't be a capital crime, but again, just to make the distinction that I'm talking about here. The point that they make is that there's a case where a guy, through reckless driving, has caused the death of someone either in another car or they hit someone on a bicycle. I don't remember the details. And the judge requires the person who killed the other person to go to their funeral, to attend. The judge himself or herself, don't recall which, went as well. And the goal was to watch how the families interacted with each other. Was it possible for some sort of rehabilitation, some sort of restoration of relationship to occur here? Again, in case where we're looking at capital punishment, it may well be that that restoration or that rehabilitation is going to be relatively minimal. I suppose we could minimally hope, though, that the restoration of right relationship with God is one of the primary goals. Skipping on down a little bit later, does the death penalty have a deterrent effect on potential killers? Now, there are folks on both sides of that argument. What reading I've done, I've tended to come across articles that argue that it isn't deterrent. In other words, because most crimes where someone is killed are crimes of passion, they're not premeditated. Somebody doesn't sit back and say, well, I'm going to go kill this person. That happens too, of course, but it's not the majority of the cases. And so, since it's a crime of passion, if you will, it isn't a case where somebody sits back and reflects on, well, what are the consequences? I better really be careful. If I kill this person, I might be subject to capital punishment. They just don't think about it that way because they're, as we said, tied up in the passion of the moment. On page 455, there's an interesting paragraph here. It's the second full paragraph, about 4 lines down. Regarding the first, statistics consistently indicate that a higher proportion of criminals who are less educated, poor, or people of color are sentenced to death than those who are white, well-educated, or economically sufficient. That just, of course, supports or is in agreement with the statistics that I cited a few minutes ago. But I think the thing that's important here to recognize is the extent to which we have a justice system that is very much slanted toward those who are well-to-do or who have majority status as far as race is concerned. It's frustrating to have to admit that, but it is where things are. And I'm sure all of you can think of some cases where this has come to our attention as a culture. in the not too distant past. But one of the things that sparked in me as I was thinking about this was, again, not a capital punishment issue, but it shows the bigger biases that end up having an impact on who does and who doesn't get condemned to the death penalty. And this was a book by Matt Taibbi that's out recently. Capitalism in the 21st Century, maybe? It's something like that. But what he talks about is how some of the things that folks engaged in around the time of our last financial collapse, 4, 5, 6 years ago, they were engaged in activities that by any reasonable definition of the terms were criminal activities. And he said in doing research for the book, he asked someone, well, how come it is none of these investment bankers went to jail for any of the things that they did? And he said it was interesting that someone responded to him with something like, well, have you ever been to jail recently? It's not a really good place to be. As if that were somehow a justification. Well, these are, higher class criminals. As a consequence of being higher class criminals, and they really shouldn't be subjected to the punishments that we see in our culture. Well, of course, that's when we talk about it with regard to the death penalty, it takes its ultimate form, those sorts of prejudices. Moving on down a little bit further, he also points out, or she, the author of this particular essay, points out the cost associated with the death penalty. When the expense of all appeals is added to the cost of the initial trial, executing a prisoner is actually more expensive than imprisoning them for life. For example, Florida, the state second only to Texas in the number of executions since 1976, averages $3.2 million per execution. This is 6 times Florida's average cost of life imprisonment. So it's an interesting thing to think about, isn't it? Now, we add to that something that has gotten a great deal of attention recently, and that is the number of cases where we've had people who've been on death row for an extended period of time only to be exonerated later by evidence. Sometimes evidence that should have been available at the time of the original trial. Other times DNA evidence, things that we can do now that we couldn't do 20 years ago when these people were initially on trial. So it's a very difficult and perplexing issue. Going forward from here, there are a number of essays. The first one, The Sanctity of Life. He talks about the difference between the term used in Thou Shalt Not Kill, compares that with other places where the death penalty is given as an instruction. So he says, this commandment not to kill and these other commandments that seem to instruct us to engage in capital punishment in certain situations, they can't really be in contradiction to each other. And so the word translated as Thou Shalt Not Kill might be better translated as Thou Shalt Not Murder. Page 463 picks up with another article. There really isn't much I want to draw out to your attention in the articles themselves. I wanted to supplement it with some of the things that we've talked about here. It's interesting, by the way, though, there was 1 or 2 points I wanted to mention to you, and one of them is on page 482. Notice of second paragraph. Justice requires punishing the guilty, as many of the guilty as possible, even if only some can be punished, and sparing the innocent, as many of the innocent as possible, even if not all are spared. But this first part, justice requires punishing the guilty. I mean, that's an interesting claim to make, isn't it? Because, in fact, God has made provision. We just celebrated last week God's provision for making sure that justice was not what happened to each of us. We got better than what we deserved. We deserved separation from God, and instead what we get is the offer of complete forgiveness and restoration. I don't want to go into that in a whole lot of detail. It just struck me as an interesting presupposition for a Christian to bring into a discussion, that justice requires this balancing of the eternal scales, if you will. All right, that summarizes what I wanted to do in talking to you about capital punishment for this week. I will post the link to the additional, or to that Bureau of Justice Statistics site. I don't require any specific amount of review of that. I'd like for you to go there and just poke around, see if you find something interesting. The death penalty stuff is kind of together, so you should be able to take a look at that. And then I'll be posting questions and looking forward to your discussion. You folks are doing a great job. I had hoped to get all your papers graded last week, so I will be working on those yet this week, and look forward to getting those back to you. I'm hoping to have them all done by the end of the week. Thanks for your patience, and look forward to our discussions this week. Take care.